When my mother called to tell me not to bother coming to Rachel's wedding because it was no place for failures, I was standing in my kitchen preparing dinner after another 12-hour shift at the hospital. The phone nearly slipped from my hands into the pot of boiling water. 3 years of supporting my family through every crisis, and somehow I had become the embarrassment they needed to hide from their guests. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Thursday evening in late October, during that transitional period when autumn's beauty gives way to winter's harsh reality. I had just arrived home from my shift at Memorial Hospital in Portland, where I worked as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit. My feet ached with the particular exhaustion that comes from standing for 12 consecutive hours, moving between patient rooms, monitoring vital signs, administering medications, and providing the kind of attentive care that keeps critically ill people alive through their most vulnerable moments. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in the Selwood neighborhood, chosen primarily for its reasonable rent and proximity to the hospital. The space was small but functional, with large windows that overlooked a tree-lined street and allowed natural light to flood the living area during daylight hours. The furniture was second-hand but well-maintained, acquired gradually through patient accumulation rather than coordinated interior design. The overall effect was comfortable rather than stylish, reflecting the practical priorities of someone whose limited resources were allocated toward necessities rather than aesthetic preferences. I had changed out of my scrubs into comfortable clothes and was beginning to prepare a simple dinner when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. My mother's name appeared on the screen with the photo I had assigned to her contact information, a picture from a family gathering 3 years earlier when relationships had been less complicated and my presence had been welcome rather than problematic. I answered the call while continuing to fill a pot with water for pasta, anticipating a routine conversation about family news or logistics for the upcoming holiday season. "Hello, Mom. How are you?" There was a brief pause before she responded, the kind of hesitation that in retrospect should have signaled that this would not be a routine conversation. Her voice when she finally spoke carried a tone I had learned to recognize over years of experience, the particular combination of forced casualness and underlying tension that indicated she was about to deliver information she knew would be poorly received but had decided was necessary regardless of my response. "Victoria, I need to talk to you about Rachel's wedding." My sister Rachel's wedding had been the primary topic of family conversations for the past 8 months, ever since she had announced her engagement to Christopher Aldridge during a family dinner that I had attended despite working a double shift the previous day. The wedding was planned for December, a winter ceremony that Rachel had envisioned as an elegant affair with crystalline decorations, rich jewel tones, and sophisticated ambience that would be photographed extensively for sharing across social media platforms where she maintained carefully curated accounts documenting her life's highlight moments. I had been involved peripherally in the wedding planning process, receiving updates during family phone calls and being consulted occasionally about minor details that required group input. My primary contribution had been financial rather than participatory. Over the preceding months, I had contributed $4,000 toward various wedding expenses when my parents had explained that the budget was stretched beyond their capacity, and they needed help ensuring Rachel could have the wedding she had always dreamed of having. I had transferred the money in 3 installments, each one representing a significant percentage of my monthly income after essential expenses were covered. "What about the wedding? Do you need me to help with something else?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with the ambient sound of my mother's breathing and background noise from her environment. I stopped preparing dinner and gave the phone call my full attention, sensing that whatever was coming required focus beyond the divided concentration I had been providing while multitasking. "Actually, Victoria, your father and I have been discussing this with Rachel and Christopher, and we think it might be best if you didn't attend the wedding." The words registered cognitively before their emotional impact fully materialized. I heard what she said and understood the literal meaning of each individual word, but the sentence as a complete thought seemed to resist integration into my understanding of reality. I had been excluded from events before, missed gatherings due to work obligations, been unable to attend celebrations because of scheduling conflicts or financial constraints. But this was different. This was my sister's wedding, and I was being told not to attend not because of logistical impossibility, but because my presence was unwanted. "I don't understand," Why wouldn't I attend Rachel's wedding? My mother's response came more quickly this time, as though she had rehearsed this portion of the conversation and was relieved to move past the initial announcement toward the explanation she had prepared. The thing is, Victoria, the wedding is going to be quite a high-profile event. Christopher's family moves in certain circles, and there will be guests there who are very successful, very established people. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, people who have really made something of themselves. Rachel is concerned about how things will look, and frankly, your father and I agree with her that it might be awkward having you there given your current situation. My current situation? The phrase hung in the air like something toxic, vague enough to avoid explicit statement while clearly referencing specific judgments about my life circumstances. I felt my pulse accelerate and my face flush with the physiological response to emotional injury that occurs before conscious thought fully processes the nature of the offense. What exactly about my current situation makes me inappropriate for Rachel's wedding? I heard my mother sigh, a sound of impatience or frustration that suggested she found my request for clarification unnecessarily difficult. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from cautious delivery of uncomfortable news toward something sharper, more direct, as though my failure to accept her initial explanation without resistance had exhausted her patience for diplomatic phrasing. Victoria, you're 32 years old and you're still just a nurse. You live in a tiny apartment, you don't have a husband or even a serious boyfriend, and you certainly don't have the kind of career or lifestyle that would impress Christopher's family. Rachel worked very hard to create the right image for this wedding, and having her older sister there as a reminder of what failure looks like would be awkward for everyone. This day is about Rachel and Christopher, and we need to prioritize what's best for them rather than worrying about your feelings. Just a nurse. The phrase detonated in my consciousness with particular force because it dismissed not only my professional identity, but the countless hours of education, training, and daily sacrifice that nursing required. I had spent 4 years completing my Bachelor of Science in Nursing degree, while working part-time to minimize student loan debt. I had passed the NCLEX licensing examination on my first attempt. I had completed additional certification in critical care nursing to qualify for ICU positions. I worked in an environment where my decisions directly impacted whether critically ill patients survived or declined, where my clinical judgment and technical skills were exercised constantly under conditions of significant stress and complexity. Just a nurse, as though the work I did was somehow less valuable than the corporate positions held by the successful, established people who would be attending Rachel's wedding, and whose impression of our family was apparently more important than my inclusion in a milestone family event. Mom, I've given Rachel $4,000 toward this wedding. I've supported this family financially for years every time any of you needed help. And now you're telling me I can't attend because I'm an embarrassment? My voice had risen despite my attempt to maintain composure, the emotion breaking through the calm professional demeanor I typically maintained even during difficult conversations. I was standing in my small kitchen with a pot of water beginning to boil on the stove, still wearing the comfortable clothes I had changed into after spending 12 hours caring for critically ill patients, being informed by my mother that my presence at my sister's wedding would be inappropriate because I had not achieved the kind of visible success that would impress people I had never met and had no relationship with. Don't be dramatic, Victoria. This isn't about you being an embarrassment. It's about Rachel wanting her wedding to be perfect, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions about the guest list. You can see photos afterward, and we'll have a family dinner once they're back from the honeymoon. It's really not that big of a deal. Not that big of a deal. My exclusion from my sister's wedding, an event I had helped fund with money I could barely afford to contribute, was being characterized as a minor inconvenience that I was overreacting to by expressing hurt or confusion. The dismissal of my emotional response felt in some ways more devastating than the initial exclusion itself, because it communicated that my feelings about this situation were not just unimportant but actively inappropriate, evidence of dramatic tendencies rather than legitimate reaction to genuine injury. Does Rachel know you're calling me? Is this actually her decision, or is this you and Dad deciding what's best for everyone without consulting the people it affects? There was another pause, briefer this time, before my mother responded with a tone that suggested my question was both irrelevant and vaguely offensive. Of course Rachel knows. This was a family discussion and we all agreed that this was the best approach. Rachel specifically mentioned that she didn't want any drama at her wedding, And she was worried that you might make things awkward by being obviously out of place among Christopher's family and their friends. She's trying to make a good impression, and we all need to support that rather than making this about our own egos. I became aware that the water on the stove had reached a full boil and was beginning to bubble over the sides of the pot. I turned off the burner and moved the pot to a cool surface, watching the water gradually settle from violent agitation back toward stillness. The physical action provided momentary focus for hands that wanted to shake, and gave me several seconds to formulate a response that would not consist entirely of the anger that was building beneath the hurt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need to go. Thank you for letting me know that I'm not welcome at Rachel's wedding. I ended the call before my mother could respond, pressing the disconnect button with more force than necessary, and then setting the phone face down on the counter as though not seeing the screen could somehow prevent any follow-up messages or calls from penetrating my awareness. I stood motionless in my kitchen, staring at the pot of cooling water, trying to process what had just occurred, and what it revealed about my family's perception of my value, and my place within our relationships. The apartment around me suddenly felt different, smaller and more isolating than it had seemed just minutes earlier before the phone call. The second-hand furniture that had seemed adequate now appeared shabby. The small space that had felt cozy now seemed cramped. The practical choices I had made about where and how to live, decisions based on prioritizing financial stability and proximity to work over aesthetic preferences or status signaling, now felt like evidence of failure rather than responsible adult decision-making. I walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street below. The trees that had seemed beautiful just hours earlier during my drive home now appeared stark and lifeless in the fading October light. Cars moved past with their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, carrying people toward homes and families and lives that presumably did not include the particular humiliation of being uninvited from family events because their existence was considered embarrassing to others. The financial dimension of the exclusion created additional layers of pain beyond the immediate rejection. $4,000 represented approximately 6 weeks of my take-home pay after taxes, retirement contributions, health insurance premiums, and other deductions reduced my gross salary to actual disposable income. I had transferred that money in 3 separate installments over 5 months, each time reassuring myself that supporting family was more important than the various personal purchases or experiences I was deferring in order to make the contributions possible. The first installment of $1,500 had been requested in May, when my mother had called to explain that the venue Rachel wanted required a substantial deposit, and they were short of the amount needed to secure the date. I had checked my savings account balance, calculated how much I could transfer without dropping below the minimum emergency fund I tried to maintain, and sent the money within 24 hours of the request. My mother had responded with a brief text message expressing appreciation, and promising that the family would find a way to pay me back once things were less financially tight. The second installment of $1,200 had been requested in July, this time to cover the cost of Rachel's wedding dress, which had exceeded her budget by an amount that seemed impossibly large for a single garment but which I was assured was actually quite reasonable for a quality designer gown appropriate for the kind of wedding Rachel was planning. I had been in the middle of a particularly difficult financial month at that point, having just paid for unexpected car repairs, and dealing with increased rent following my lease renewal. I had transferred the money anyway, reasoning that Rachel's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and that I could manage my own budget constraints through additional careful economy over the subsequent months. The third installment of $1,300 had been requested in September, covering miscellaneous expenses that my parents described vaguely as including flowers, decorations, and other aesthetic elements that were essential for creating the elegant atmosphere Rachel envisioned. By that point, I was no longer tracking the specific purposes of my contributions, simply accepting that the wedding was more expensive than initially planned, and that family members were expected to help cover the expanding costs. I had transferred the money without extensive questioning, taking pride in being someone who could be relied upon to help during family financial needs, even when doing so required personal sacrifice. Now, standing in my kitchen processing the information that I was being excluded from the event I had helped finance, the money took on different significance. It represented not family solidarity or generous support, but rather payment for the privilege of being considered expendable, investment in an event where my presence was considered detrimental, despite my financial contribution being considered essential. The transactional nature of the relationship had been present throughout but was now impossible to ignore or rationalize as anything other than exploitation. I picked up my phone and opened the text message thread with Rachel, scrolling back through several months of conversations. The messages showed a consistent pattern where Rachel initiated contact primarily when she needed something, whether that was financial contribution, opinion on wedding details, or help with logistical arrangements. My messages included expressions of excitement about the wedding, questions about her planning process, and offers to help in whatever ways would be most useful. Her responses were brief and functional, acknowledging my offers without particular warmth or reciprocal interest in my life circumstances. There were no messages in the thread where Rachel had asked how I was doing, inquired about my work, or expressed interest in any dimension of my life beyond my utility in supporting her wedding preparations. The one-sided nature of our communication had been present throughout but had not registered as particularly unusual, because it matched the broader pattern of our family relationships over recent years. I had become accustomed to being the person who provided support rather than received it, who offered help rather than requested it, who maintained relationships through consistent effort that was not proportionally reciprocated. I composed and deleted several text messages to Rachel, each attempt beginning with some variation of asking whether she was aware that I had been uninvited from her wedding, and whether this actually represented her wishes or whether our mother had made this decision independently. Each draft felt inadequate, either too angry and accusatory or too pleading and pathetic. I eventually closed the messaging app without sending anything, recognizing that the specific details of who initiated the exclusion mattered less than the fundamental reality that my family had collectively decided my presence was unwanted. The evening stretched ahead with the particular emptiness that follows unexpected emotional injury. I had lost interest in preparing dinner, and instead stood in my kitchen trying to determine what appropriate response looked like to learning that your family considers you an embarrassment unsuitable for inclusion in important events. The situation seemed to resist easy categorization or clear action plan. This was not a problem that could be solved through additional effort or improved performance. This was rejection based on fundamental assessment of my worth, as measured against external status markers rather than character, contribution, or relationship history. I thought about the patients I had cared for during my shift earlier that day, people fighting for their lives with the kind of determination that made my family drama seem trivially self-indulgent by comparison. I had spent my morning managing the care of a 67-year-old woman recovering from major cardiac surgery, monitoring her vital signs closely for any indication of complications, adjusting her medication drip rates based on subtle changes in her cardiovascular response, and providing the kind of attentive skilled nursing that would help determine whether she survived or declined during the critical first days following her procedure. I had spent my afternoon caring for a 23-year-old man who had been in a severe motorcycle accident, his body broken in multiple places. His family gathered in the waiting room desperately hoping for any positive news about his prognosis. Those patients and their families had perspective about what actually mattered, about the difference between genuine crisis and the kind of social drama that seemed devastating in the moment, but was ultimately about hurt feelings and damaged pride rather than actual survival. Yet even with that perspective available to me intellectually, I could not prevent the emotional impact of my family's rejection from feeling significant and painful in ways that resisted rational minimization. I picked up my phone again and called my best friend Jennifer, who answered on the second ring with her characteristic warmth and immediate attention. "Hey Victoria, what's going on?" I could hear background noise suggesting she was at home with her family, the sounds of her children playing and her husband saying something in another room. Jennifer was a physician assistant who worked at the same hospital where I was employed, and we had developed close friendship over our 5 years as colleagues before becoming the kind of friends who maintained connection outside of work through regular communication and occasional social gatherings. My family just uninvited me from Rachel's wedding because apparently I'm too much of a failure to be seen with Christopher's successful family and friends. There was a brief pause while Jennifer processed this information, followed by an expression of shock and immediate supportive indignation that provided the first moment of emotional validation I had experienced since my mother's phone call. "Are you serious? They actually said that to you?" I provided a summary of the conversation with my mother, including the specific phrase about me being just a nurse and the characterization of my presence as potentially awkward for people who had really made something of themselves. Jennifer listened without interruption, allowing me to articulate the full scope of the situation before responding. Victoria, that is absolutely outrageous. You're an ICU nurse, which means you have one of the most demanding and important jobs anyone can have. You literally keep people alive for a living. And they're treating you like you're some kind of embarrassment because you don't have whatever pretentious career or lifestyle they think would impress Christopher's family. That's completely insane. Her validation helped, though it could not completely offset the pain of the rejection itself. External reassurance that my family's assessment was unreasonable provided intellectual comfort, but could not fully address the emotional injury of learning that people who were supposed to value me unconditionally had instead applied conditional acceptance based on status criteria I had not achieved and had not known were being used to evaluate my worth. The worst part is that I've given them $4,000 for this wedding. I've been supporting my family financially for years every time any of them needed help. And apparently all of that means nothing compared to the fact that I don't have the right kind of impressive career or lifestyle to be included in Rachel's perfect day. Jennifer's response was immediate and emphatic. You need to get that money back. If they're going to exclude you from the wedding, they don't get to keep your financial contribution. That's basic fairness. The suggestion felt simultaneously obvious and impossible. Of course I should be entitled to return of money contributed toward an event I was being prevented from attending. Yet the thought of actually requesting that return felt fraught with complications, likely to generate accusations that I was being petty or vindictive, that I was making Rachel's wedding about my own hurt feelings rather than supporting her happiness regardless of whether my presence was wanted. I don't know if I can do that. It would create so much family drama, and they would all say I'm being selfish and ruining Rachel's wedding over my own ego. Jennifer's tone shifted into something firmer, the voice she used when providing medical instructions to patients who were resistant to necessary interventions. Victoria, listen to me. You are not the one creating drama here. They created drama by excluding you from a family wedding, because they think you're not successful enough to be seen in public. You are not the problem in this situation. And you are not being selfish by refusing to finance an event that you're being told you cannot attend. You need to stop thinking about how they'll react and start thinking about what you deserve, which is basic respect and fair treatment. We talked for another 30 minutes, with Jennifer helping me process the situation and begin considering what appropriate response might look like beyond simply accepting the exclusion and absorbing the emotional and financial costs without resistance. By the time we ended the call, I had not reached definitive decisions about specific actions but had achieved somewhat clearer perspective about the fundamental dynamics at play, and the distinction between my family's characterization of my response as dramatic or selfish versus the reality that I was simply refusing to accept exploitation without objection. I did not sleep well that night, lying in bed reviewing years of family interactions and identifying patterns that had been present throughout but which I had not previously assembled into coherent understanding of how I was perceived and valued by the people who should have been most committed to my well-being. The exclusion from Rachel's wedding was not an isolated incident, but rather the most explicit manifestation of attitudes and dynamics that had been operating for years through more subtle mechanisms. The morning after my mother's phone call, I woke early despite having slept poorly, my mind immediately returning to the conversation and its implications before I had fully transitioned from sleep to wakefulness. The bedroom was dim with the gray light of pre-dawn Portland autumn, and I lay still for several minutes staring at the ceiling while my thoughts organized themselves around a question that had been forming throughout the restless night. How had I arrived at a point where my family felt comfortable excluding me from significant events, while simultaneously expecting my continued financial support and emotional availability whenever they experienced needs I could help address? The answer required examining the foundation of family dynamics that had been established years earlier, patterns that had developed gradually through accumulated interactions, rather than through any single defining moment. I rose from bed and began preparing for my shift at the hospital, moving through my morning routine with automatic efficiency, while my consciousness remained focused on reconstructing the history of how these relationships had evolved into their current dysfunctional state. My relationship with my family had not always been characterized by the one-sided support dynamic that now defined our interactions. During my childhood and adolescence, our family had functioned with relatively normal reciprocity, where care and attention flowed in multiple directions, and where my parents invested substantially in my development and well-being. My father had worked as a middle manager at a manufacturing company, providing stable income that supported comfortable middle-class lifestyle. My mother had worked part-time in administrative roles while managing household responsibilities and maintaining active involvement in my school activities and extracurricular pursuits. Rachel was 4 years younger than me, and our relationship during childhood had contained the typical mixture of sibling rivalry and genuine affection that characterized most families with two daughters relatively close in age. We competed for parental attention and resources, argued over toys and territory, and perceived inequities in how we were treated, but also played together, shared confidences, and generally functioned as allies navigating the challenges of growing up within the same family system. There had been no indication during those years that our relationship would eventually deteriorate into the transactional dynamic that now existed, where I provided support without reciprocation, and where my value was assessed primarily through the lens of whether my life circumstances reflected positively or negatively on her social standing. The shift had begun during my college years, when I attended Oregon State University pursuing my nursing degree, while Rachel remained at home completing her final years of high school. My parents had provided moderate financial support for my education, covering approximately 40% of total costs through a combination of direct payments and co-signing student loans that I would eventually be responsible for repaying. I had covered the remaining 60% through a combination of part-time employment, competitive scholarships I had earned through strong academic performance, and additional student loans taken in my own name. The experience of financing my own education while watching my parents struggle to provide even partial support had created my first significant awareness of our family's financial limitations. My father's income had been sufficient for comfortable living when expenses consisted primarily of housing, utilities, food, and general household costs. However, college expenses represented a magnitude of financial burden that strained their resources substantially, particularly as they were simultaneously beginning to save for Rachel's eventual educational costs and dealing with the normal accumulation of expenses that accompany middle age, including increasing healthcare costs and the need to begin serious retirement planning. I had graduated with $38,000 in student loan debt, a figure that seemed manageable based on expected nursing salaries, but which represented substantial monthly obligations once I entered repayment. My first nursing position had been at a smaller community hospital in Salem, where I worked night shifts in the medical surgical unit, while completing the minimum 1 year of general nursing experience that most specialized departments required before considering candidates for positions. The work had been demanding and the compensation modest, but I had approached it with the understanding that this represented necessary foundation for eventual advancement into more desirable specialties and shifts. Rachel had attended community college for 2 years following her high school graduation, living at home and working part-time in retail, while completing general education requirements at significantly lower cost than traditional 4-year university enrollment. My parents had been able to cover her community college expenses entirely without requiring her to take student loans, a difference in how our educations were financed that I had noticed but had not initially interpreted as inequitable treatment. The practical explanation was that community college simply cost less than university, and that my parents' financial situation had improved somewhat during the years between my enrollment and Rachel's, making it possible for them to provide more comprehensive support than had been available during my college years. However, when Rachel transferred to Portland State University to complete her bachelor's degree in communications, my parents had again covered the majority of her costs through a combination of direct payments and Parent Plus loans that they assumed responsibility for repaying. Rachel graduated with only $12,000 in student loan debt under her own name, less than 1/3 of the amount I had accumulated despite her having completed the same total years of higher education. The disparity had been explained through various justifications, including that Rachel had been more strategic about minimizing costs through her community college pathway, that my parents had learned from their experience financing my education and had planned more effectively for Rachel's, and that different degree programs simply carried different total costs. I had accepted these explanations without extensive questioning, operating under the assumption that parents naturally do their best for each child, and that differences in support reflect practical constraints rather than preferential treatment. I had been proud of my independence and capability to finance my own education largely without parental assistance, viewing this as evidence of maturity and self-sufficiency rather than as indication that I received less investment than my younger sibling. My first significant financial support of my family occurred approximately 6 months after I had completed my nursing degree and secured my initial position in Salem. My father had called on a Sunday afternoon, his voice carrying the particular quality of stress that indicated significant problem requiring immediate attention. His car had experienced major mechanical failure, and the repair estimate exceeded $4,000 for engine work that could not be deferred without rendering the vehicle completely inoperable. Their savings had recently been depleted through a combination of helping Rachel with her university expenses and dealing with unexpected home repairs, and they did not have available funds to cover the car repair without depleting emergency reserves to dangerous levels. I had been living extremely frugally during my first months of employment, directing maximum resources toward student loan repayment while keeping other expenses minimal. My apartment had been a studio unit in an older building, sparsely furnished with items from second-hand stores and furnished with minimal attention to aesthetics or comfort. I had been eating simple meals prepared at home, avoiding entertainment expenses beyond basic internet service, and generally living with the kind of strict economy that allowed me to make aggressive student loan payments that would minimize total interest costs over the repayment period. When my father called requesting help with the car repair, I had approximately $6,000 in savings beyond the emergency fund minimum I tried to maintain. Lending $4,000 would substantially reduce my financial cushion and would require me to reduce my student loan payments back to minimum required amounts rather than the accelerated payments I had been making. However, my father clearly needed the assistance, and I had the resources available to provide it. I had transferred the money the following day, telling my father to repay me whenever his financial situation improved sufficiently to make that possible without creating hardship. He had expressed deep gratitude and had assured me that repayment would occur within a few months, once they recovered from their current financial strain. The repayment had never occurred. After several months had passed without any mention of the loan, I had raised the topic during a phone conversation, framing it as gentle inquiry rather than demand for immediate payment. My father had responded with obvious discomfort, explaining that their financial situation remained tight, and that repayment would need to wait a bit longer. I had assured him that I was not pressuring him, and that he should take whatever time was necessary, genuinely wanting to be understanding about his circumstances rather than creating additional stress through insistence on rigid repayment timeline. The loan had gradually transformed in family discussion from temporary assistance that would be repaid to gift that had been generously provided to help parents during difficult period. The linguistic shift had occurred without explicit conversation or conscious decision, simply through accumulated references that characterized the money as something I had given rather than lent. I had noticed this transformation but had not corrected it, partly because I recognized that my parents genuinely were experiencing financial constraints, and partly because insisting on repayment felt uncomfortably close to valuing money over family relationships. That initial $4,000 loan that became a gift established the pattern that would characterize my financial relationship with my family over the subsequent years. Approximately every 6 to 8 months, one of my parents or Rachel would contact me with an urgent financial need that they could not meet through their own resources. The requests varied in specific details but followed consistent themes involving car repairs, medical expenses not fully covered by insurance, temporary shortfalls in rent or mortgage payments, or other immediate costs that could not be deferred or reduced without significant negative consequences. Each request was accompanied by assurances that this was a temporary situation, that repayment would occur once circumstances improved, and that they would not need to ask for help again once they got past the current crisis. Each time I evaluated my own financial situation, determined what I could provide without creating genuine hardship for myself, and transferred the requested amount with instructions to repay me when possible, but without aggressive insistence on specific timeline. Each loan eventually transformed into a gift through the same gradual linguistic drift, where references to repayment became less frequent and eventually disappeared entirely from family conversations. Over approximately 8 years, I had provided nearly $37,000 in financial support to my family through these accumulated requests. The amount was substantial enough that I had begun tracking it in a private spreadsheet approximately 3 years earlier, When I had noticed that the frequency of requests seemed to be increasing, and when I had begun to feel vague discomfort about the pattern even though I could not articulate precisely what felt problematic about it. The spreadsheet documented each transfer with date, amount, stated purpose, and whether any repayment had occurred. The repayment column was entirely empty except for a single $200 payment my father had made 18 months earlier, an amount so small relative to total loans that it had felt almost insulting, rather than representing genuine effort toward addressing the accumulated debt. The financial support I provided was not limited to direct loans for specific emergencies. I had also become the family member who could be relied upon to cover various smaller expenses and to provide support that, while not involving large single transfers, accumulated substantially over time. I paid for family dinners when we gathered for celebrations, covering restaurant bills that often exceeded $200 for meals at the types of establishments Rachel preferred. I purchased birthday and holiday gifts that were significantly more expensive than what I received in return, operating under the assumption that my higher income and lack of dependence meant I should be more generous than family members who had greater financial constraints. When my parents had needed to replace their washing machine 2 years earlier, I had researched models, compared prices, and ultimately purchased a quality appliance that cost $900, delivering it to their home and arranging for installation while they were at work so they would return to find the problem solved without needing to navigate the research and purchase process themselves. When Rachel had needed a new laptop for her work in social media management, I had bought her a MacBook Pro costing $1,800, selecting specifications that would meet her needs and wrapping it as a combination birthday and Christmas gift that had required me to forego purchasing anything significant for myself during that period. The pattern of financial support had been accompanied by increasing expectation that I would be available for other types of assistance as well. I had become the family member who could be called upon to provide rides to airport at inconvenient hours, to help with moving furniture or organizing storage spaces, to research solutions for various household or technical problems, and generally to serve as reliable resource for whatever needs emerged. Each individual request had been reasonable and had not required extraordinary sacrifice, but the accumulated effect was that significant portion of my limited personal time was allocated toward family obligations that were not reciprocated when I occasionally needed assistance. My work as an intensive care nurse involved rotating shifts including nights, weekends, and holidays, a schedule that made maintaining normal social relationships challenging, and that created particular need for flexibility and understanding from family members when coordinating gatherings or celebrations. However, my family had consistently demonstrated minimal accommodation for my schedule constraints, instead expressing disappointment or frustration when I was unable to attend events that conflicted with work obligations, or when I needed to leave gatherings early to get adequate sleep before working night shifts. Rachel's attitude toward my profession had evolved over the years from neutral recognition that I worked in healthcare to increasingly dismissive characterization that positioned nursing as less impressive or valuable than other career paths. She had developed a social circle that included individuals working in technology, finance, creative industries, and other fields that she viewed as more prestigious or interesting than healthcare. Her social media presence carefully curated images and narratives that emphasized her connections to people and experiences that signaled sophistication, cultural awareness, and upward mobility. During family gatherings, Rachel would often discuss her work in social media management with enthusiasm and detail, describing campaigns she was developing, brands she was working with, and industry events she was attending. When conversation turned to my work, she would listen with obvious disinterest, often checking her phone or finding reasons to excuse herself from the discussion. On several occasions, she had made comments that characterized nursing as repetitive or limited, suggesting that the work involved following protocols rather than creative problem-solving, and implying that the profession lacked the intellectual challenge of fields she considered more demanding. My parents had not explicitly endorsed Rachel's dismissive attitude toward my career, but neither had they challenged it or defended the value and importance of nursing work. Their responses to her comments have been characterized by diplomatic silence, or by redirecting conversation toward neutral topics, rather than by asserting that nursing represented important and demanding work requiring substantial skill and dedication. Their passive acceptance of Rachel's characterization had communicated implicit agreement that my profession was indeed less impressive than alternatives I might have pursued, even though they never stated this view directly. The most painful dimension of the family dynamics was not the financial exploitation or the lack of reciprocity and practical support, though both of those patterns created legitimate grievances. The deeper injury came from the growing recognition that my family's perception of my value was fundamentally conditional, based on assessments of my life circumstances against external markers of success, rather than on intrinsic worth or the quality of our relationships. I was valuable to the extent that I could provide resources or assistance when they experienced needs, but my presence was not desired when it might reflect negatively on the image they wanted to project to others. The wedding exclusion had crystallized this reality with painful clarity. For years, I had provided financial support, practical assistance, and emotional availability whenever my family needed anything I could offer. I had sacrificed personal financial goals, deferred my own needs, and organized my life around being a reliable resource for family members who rarely reciprocated. Yet despite all of that investment in maintaining family relationships, I was now being excluded from my sister's wedding because my life circumstances did not align with the aesthetic she wanted to create for her special day. The exclusion communicated several messages simultaneously. It said that my years of financial generosity and practical support had not earned me basic inclusion in family celebrations. It said that my presence was considered detrimental to Rachel's happiness and success rather than additive or even neutral. It said that the relationships I had been investing in were not actually reciprocal partnerships, but rather one-directional arrangements where I provided resources and support, while receiving conditional acceptance that could be withdrawn whenever my presence became inconvenient or potentially embarrassing. As I drove to the hospital for my shift that morning, I found myself reviewing specific memories that illustrated these dynamics, moments I had experienced but not fully processed at the time they occurred. I remembered a Christmas gathering 3 years earlier where Rachel had showed off expensive jewelry her boyfriend had given her, displaying the pieces with obvious pleasure while receiving enthusiastic admiration from our parents. When I had given her a thoughtful gift I had carefully selected based on her stated interests, she had opened it with perfunctory politeness and had set it aside without particular enthusiasm. Later that evening, I had overheard her telling a friend on the phone that most of her gifts that year had been disappointing, making no mention of the considerable thought and expense I had invested in selecting something meaningful. I remembered a conversation with my mother 18 months earlier where I had mentioned feeling exhausted from the demands of intensive care nursing and the toll of rotating shifts that disrupted normal sleep patterns and made maintaining healthy routines extremely difficult. My mother had responded with advice to consider whether I might be happier in a less demanding profession, suggesting that perhaps nursing was not the right fit for me if I was finding it so challenging. She had not offered sympathy for the difficulties I was experiencing or acknowledgement that demanding work often creates exhaustion, even when someone is well suited for the profession. Instead, she had interpreted my honest sharing of challenges as evidence that I had made poor career choices, reinforcing the narrative that my professional path represented failure, rather than dedication to important and valuable work. I remembered numerous occasions when I had needed help with various tasks, or had faced personal challenges that would have benefited from family support, only to find that my family members were consistently unavailable, or unable to provide the type of assistance I had regularly offered them. When I had been recovering from minor surgery 2 years earlier and had needed rides to follow-up appointments because I was temporarily unable to drive, my family had all been too busy with their own obligations to help, requiring me to impose on colleagues and friends who had their own demanding schedules but who demonstrated more willingness to inconvenience themselves for my benefit than my own family showed. The accumulated pattern revealed a fundamental imbalance in how care and support flowed within family relationships. I had operated under the assumption that family members naturally helped each other during times of need, and that the support I provided would be reciprocated when I faced my own challenges. However, the reality was that support flowed consistently in only one direction, from me toward family members who benefited from my generosity while feeling no corresponding obligation to provide equivalent support when circumstances were reversed. By the time I arrived at the hospital and began my shift, I had achieved clarity about several important conclusions. First, the wedding exclusion was not an isolated incident of poor judgment or temporary insensitivity, but rather represented the logical culmination of family dynamics that had been developing over years. Second, my continued financial and emotional investment in these relationships was not generating the reciprocal care and respect that I had assumed would eventually result from consistent generosity and availability. Third, meaningful change in these dynamics would not occur through continued patience and understanding, but would require me to establish clear boundaries and to prioritize my own well-being over my family's comfort and expectations. The challenge now was determining what specific actions would constitute appropriate response to the wedding exclusion and to the broader pattern it represented. I needed to decide whether to demand return of the $4,000 I had contributed to the wedding, whether to reduce or eliminate future financial support of family members, whether to communicate explicitly about how their treatment had affected me, and whether to continue investing emotional energy in relationships that were clearly not providing reciprocal care and respect. These decisions felt simultaneously obvious and impossibly difficult. The obvious response was to stop allowing myself to be exploited, to establish boundaries that protected my resources and well-being, and to require my family to demonstrate genuine care and respect as condition for continued close relationship. The difficulty came from years of conditioning that characterized prioritizing my own needs as selfish, that treated requests for reciprocity as petty scorekeeping, and that positioned accommodation of family expectations as essential to being good daughter and sister regardless of how those expectations affected my own life circumstances. I spent my shift caring for critically ill patients whose conditions required my complete focus and technical skill, providing the kind of attentive nursing care that made meaningful difference in their outcomes. During brief breaks, I found myself thinking about the contrast between how my patients and their families valued the care I provided, and how my own family dismissed my profession as less impressive than alternatives they considered more prestigious. Patients thanked me with genuine emotion for the skill and compassion I brought to their care during their most vulnerable moments. Their family members expressed deep gratitude for the way I explained complex medical situations in accessible language, and for the way I treated their loved ones with dignity and gentleness during frightening experiences. The recognition from patients and families could not completely offset the pain of my own family's rejection, but it did provide important perspective about the actual value of nursing work, regardless of how Rachel and my parents had characterized it. The work I did mattered profoundly to the people who benefited from it, even if my family viewed it as insufficiently impressive to justify my inclusion in celebrations where image and status were prioritized over relationships and genuine accomplishment. By the end of my shift, I had reached preliminary decisions about how to respond to the wedding exclusion. I would request return of the $4,000 I had contributed, framing it as simple fairness rather than as punishment or retaliation. I would establish clear boundaries around future financial support, making explicit that I was no longer available as emergency funding source for family members who did not demonstrate reciprocal care and respect. I would communicate clearly about how the exclusion had affected me, and what it revealed about the fundamental imbalance in our relationships. And I would begin the difficult process of accepting that the family relationships I had invested in so heavily were not actually providing the belonging and mutual care that had justified my years of sacrifice and accommodation. The decision to request return of my $4,000 contribution required more courage than I had initially anticipated. Over the weekend following my mother's phone call, I drafted and revised multiple versions of the message I would send to my family, each iteration attempting to strike an impossible balance between asserting my legitimate right to fair treatment and avoiding the appearance of being vindictive or petty. The challenge was that any assertion of boundaries or requests for reciprocity would inevitably be characterized by my family as evidence of selfishness, regardless of how diplomatically I phrased my position. By Sunday evening, I had settled on an approach that was direct without being aggressive, clear about my expectations without engaging in detailed recrimination about past patterns. I composed an email addressed to both of my parents and copied to Rachel, choosing written communication rather than phone conversation because it allowed me to present my complete thoughts without interruption, and created a documented record of what had been said in case future disputes emerged about the content or tone of my message. The email began with acknowledgement of the phone conversation with my mother, stating simply that I had been informed I would not be attending Rachel's wedding due to concerns about how my presence might be perceived by other guests. I noted that while I was disappointed by this decision, I respected their right to determine the guest list for the event. However, I continued, given that I was being excluded from the wedding, I was requesting return of the $4,000 I had contributed toward wedding expenses over the previous months. I explained that it seemed reasonable to expect that financial contributions would be returned when the contributor was no longer participating in the event those contributions were intended to support. I concluded the email by expressing hope that we could resolve this matter amicably, and that our family relationships could continue in a healthier form that involved more balanced reciprocity and mutual respect. I reread the message several times, checking for any language that could be characterized as hostile or accusatory, then sent it before I could reconsider or continue editing indefinitely. The message disappeared from my screen, and I felt the particular combination of relief and anxiety that accompanies taking action that cannot be reversed and whose consequences cannot be fully predicted. The response arrived within 40 minutes, far more quickly than I had expected given that I had sent the email on Sunday evening when I had assumed my family would be occupied with other activities. The reply came from my father, with my mother and Rachel copied, and the tone was immediately defensive and accusatory in ways that confirmed my concerns about how any assertion of boundaries would be received. My father's email characterized my request for return of the money as cruel and vindictive, an attempt to punish Rachel for a decision that had been made collectively by the family in her best interests. He wrote that I had given the money as a gift to support my sister's wedding, and that attempting to reclaim gifts because I was unhappy about not being invited represented deeply selfish behavior that he was shocked and disappointed to see from me. He reminded me that family members support each other without keeping score or demanding reciprocity, and that my apparent inability to be happy for Rachel without making her wedding about my own feelings demonstrated a level of immaturity that perhaps validated the concerns about how my presence at the wedding might create awkwardness. The email concluded with a statement that the money had already been spent on wedding expenses and could not be returned without forcing Rachel to make significant changes to her plans, changes that would diminish her special day because of my petty grievances about not receiving an invitation. He expressed hope that I would reconsider my demand and would choose to support my sister's happiness, rather than creating family conflict, during what should be a joyful time for everyone. I read the email twice, feeling my initial hurt transform into something sharper and clearer. The characterization of my $4,000 contribution as a gift that I had no right to reclaim was particularly galling given that each transfer had been explicitly framed as helping to cover specific wedding costs that my parents could not afford on their own. There had been no discussion of these contributions representing gifts, rather than shared family investment in an event where everyone would participate. The retroactive reframing of the money as a gift only after I had been excluded from the event it was intended to support represented exactly the kind of manipulative redefinition of reality that had characterized my family relationships for years. The accusation that I was making Rachel's wedding about my own feelings was similarly manipulative, inverting the actual dynamics at play. I had not chosen to center my own emotions or needs in Rachel's wedding planning. I had been informed that my presence was unwanted, because my life circumstances did not align with the image Rachel wanted to project. I was not demanding attention or special treatment. I was simply requesting that if I was being excluded from an event, I should not also be required to finance it. The characterization of this reasonable boundary as selfish and vindictive revealed the extent to which my family had come to view my resources and support as entitlements they deserved regardless of how they treated me. I did not respond to my father's email immediately, recognizing that replying while feeling angry would likely escalate the conflict in unproductive ways. Instead, I spent the evening reflecting on the broader pattern that this exchange exemplified. My family had developed expectations over years of accumulated interactions that I would provide financial support whenever requested, that I would accept their characterizations of situations without resistance, and that I would prioritize their comfort and preferences over my own legitimate needs and boundaries. Any deviation from these established patterns would be met with accusations of selfishness and attempts to manipulate me back into compliance through guilt and emotional pressure. The following morning I scheduled a session with my therapist, Dr. Sarachan, whom I had been seeing periodically over the past 2 years to process various work-related stress and relationship challenges. I had not seen her in approximately 4 months, having paused our sessions during a period when my financial situation had been particularly tight, and when I had convinced myself that I was managing adequately without professional support. Now, confronting the wedding exclusion and my family's response to my boundary setting, I recognized that I needed external perspective from someone trained to help people navigate complex family dynamics. Dr. Chen's office was located in a renovated house in the Hawthorne district, a space that felt more comfortable and informal than traditional medical settings. We had developed good therapeutic rapport during our previous sessions, and she had demonstrated particular insight into the ways that professional caregivers often struggle to establish appropriate boundaries in personal relationships, extending the same selfless service orientation that serves them well in their work into family dynamics where it becomes exploited rather than reciprocated. I provided Dr. Chen with a comprehensive overview of the wedding exclusion, my family's characterization of my nursing career, my years of financial support, and the response I had received when requesting return of my contribution. She listened with the focused attention that characterized her therapeutic style, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but primarily allowing me to present the full narrative without interruption. When I finished, Dr. Chen was silent for several moments before speaking, a pause that I had learned indicated she was formulating observations that she wanted to express with particular care and precision. Victoria, I want to start by validating that your response to this situation is entirely reasonable and healthy. You're experiencing appropriate anger and hurt in response to treatment that is genuinely unfair and exploitative. The fact that you're questioning whether your feelings are justified tells me that you've internalized your family's narrative, that prioritizing your own needs represents selfishness. We need to work on helping you recognize that establishing boundaries and expecting reciprocal care in relationships is not selfish. It's essential for your well-being. She continued by noting that my family's dynamics exhibited several characteristics common to systems where one member becomes designated as the caretaker whose role is to provide support without receiving equivalent care in return. This designation often occurs not through conscious family discussion, but through gradual establishment of patterns where the caretaker demonstrates capability and willingness to help, and where other family members become accustomed to relying on that help without examining whether the arrangement is equitable or sustainable. What I'm seeing in what you've described is a family system that has organized itself around your availability as a resource while simultaneously devaluing your worth as a person, Dr. Chen said. They want access to your financial support and your practical assistance, but they don't want to include you in family celebrations because they've decided that your life circumstances don't reflect well on them. That's profoundly dysfunctional. And the fact that they're responding to your reasonable boundaries with accusations of selfishness is a classic example of how families resist change when someone stops accepting exploitation. We discussed specific strategies for maintaining boundaries in the face of my family's inevitable continued pressure and manipulation. Dr. Chen emphasized that I should expect escalation before acceptance, a pattern where my family would likely increase their emotional pressure, recruit other family members or family friends to try to convince me to back down, and possibly even threaten complete relationship cutoff if I did not return to my previous role of compliant financial support, without expectation of fair treatment. The key is to remain consistent with your boundaries regardless of how much pressure they apply. Dr. Chen explained. Every time you give in to their manipulation, you teach them that if they push hard enough, you will eventually comply. The only way to establish new patterns is to maintain your position even when they make it emotionally difficult to do so. She also helped me identify the underlying beliefs that had made me vulnerable to this exploitation. I had internalized messages throughout my life that being a good family member meant prioritizing others' needs over my own, that asking for reciprocity represented keeping score in ways that were petty and small-minded, and that my value as a person was connected to my usefulness to others rather than to my intrinsic worth. These beliefs had been reinforced through years of family interactions and through broader cultural messages about women's roles as caregivers and supporters, making them feel like natural and inevitable ways of understanding relationships, rather than as learned patterns that could be examined and changed. By the end of our session, I had greater clarity about the psychological dynamics at play and stronger conviction that my response to the wedding exclusion was appropriate rather than selfish. Dr. Chen had helped me see that my family's characterization of my boundary setting as vindictive was itself a manipulative tactic designed to pressure me back into compliance, and that my continued financial and emotional support of family members who treated me with such conditional regard would only perpetuate the dysfunction rather than eventually leading to the reciprocal care I hoped would materialize. Over the following days, I received multiple additional messages from family members, each attempting to convince me to withdraw my request for return of the wedding contribution through various approaches. My mother called and left a voicemail expressing hurt that I was causing so much stress during what should be a happy time for Rachel, emphasizing how much work had gone into planning the wedding, and how my demands were threatening to ruin everything. Rachel sent a text message that oscillated between wounded accusations and manipulative appeals, first telling me that she could not believe I was being so cruel to her, then suggesting that perhaps if I apologized and promised not to cause any problems, she might reconsider the decision to exclude me from the wedding. Each message followed predictable patterns of emotional manipulation, attempting to make me feel guilty for establishing boundaries, while avoiding any acknowledgement of the fundamental unfairness of excluding me from an event I had helped finance. None of the messages addressed the core issue, which was that I had been deemed insufficiently successful to be included in family celebrations despite years of providing financial support that had enabled various family members to maintain lifestyles and pursue opportunities they could not have afforded through their own resources alone. I responded to none of these messages, following Dr. Chen's advice to avoid engaging with attempts to draw me into defensive arguments or detailed justifications of my position. I had stated my boundary clearly in my initial email. Further discussion would only provide opportunities for my family to find new angles of attack or new ways to reframe the situation to position me as the unreasonable party. Silence communicated that my position was not subject to negotiation, and that emotional manipulation would not succeed in changing my decision. The week before Rachel's wedding, my father made a final attempt at resolution, calling me directly rather than communicating through email or text. I answered the call while sitting in my apartment on an evening off from work, having just finished a simple dinner and prepared to spend the evening reading and decompressing from a particularly challenging series of shifts. "Victoria, we need to talk about this wedding situation," my father began, his tone carrying an authoritative quality that suggested he had decided to approach this conversation as a parent instructing a child rather than as one adult communicating with another. "Your mother and I have discussed this extensively, and we've decided that we're willing to compromise. We'll give you back half of the money you contributed, $2,000, if you'll agree to drop this issue and allow Rachel to have her wedding without all this conflict and stress you're creating." The offer was presented as though it represented generous concession on their part, a splitting of the difference that any reasonable person would recognize as fair resolution to our disagreement. However, the framing revealed several problematic assumptions. First, it characterized the conflict as something I was creating rather than as something that resulted from their decision to exclude me from a family event while keeping my money. Second, it suggested that returning only half of my contribution represented compromise rather than continued exploitation. Third, it implied that I should be grateful for this partial return, and should accept it without further objection in order to preserve family harmony. "Dad, I contributed $4,000 to Rachel's wedding with the understanding that I would be attending as a member of the family. I'm now being told that I cannot attend because my presence would be embarrassing. It's not unreasonable for me to expect that if I'm not attending the wedding, the full amount I contributed should be returned. This isn't about compromise or splitting the difference. This is about basic fairness." My father's response was immediate and sharp, his reasonable tone evaporating into frustration and anger. "You know what, Victoria? This whole situation is making it very clear why we had concerns about including you in the wedding. You're being incredibly selfish and petty, and you're showing that you care more about money than about your sister's happiness. We offered you a reasonable compromise, and the fact that you're refusing to accept it just proves that you're more interested in punishing us than in resolving this like an adult." The conversation deteriorated from there into accusations and recriminations that covered familiar territory without producing any movement toward resolution. My father reiterated that the money had been a gift that I had no right to reclaim. I responded that contributions to an event that the contributor expects to attend are not gifts, but shared investments in family celebration. He argued that family members should support each other without keeping score. I noted that support should flow in multiple directions, rather than consistently from me toward family members who did not reciprocate. He suggested that my nursing career had perhaps made me cynical and transactional in how I viewed relationships. I observed that my career had taught me to value people's actual well-being over their comfort, with maintaining exploitative dynamics. The call ended without resolution, with my father informing me that he was disappointed in who I had become, and that he hoped I would eventually recognize how badly I was handling this situation. I sat in my apartment after the call concluded, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that accompanies confrontation with family members, where you maintain your boundaries despite intense pressure to abandon them. There was satisfaction in having articulated my position clearly, and in having refused to accept the manipulative compromise offer. There was also grief about the evident reality that my family relationships were fundamentally damaged in ways that might not be reparable, that the belonging I had been trying to purchase through years of financial generosity and selfless support had never actually been available regardless of how much I invested. Rachel's wedding occurred on a Saturday in mid-December, a date that I knew primarily because I had seen reminders about it in my email inbox from vendors whose services I had helped research during the early planning phases. I worked a shift at the hospital that day, caring for patients whose medical crises provided helpful perspective about the relative importance of family drama compared to genuine matters of life and death. During my break, I sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking coffee and imagining the wedding proceeding without me, Rachel in her expensive dress that I had partially financed, my parents greeting guests and introducing Rachel's new husband's family to relatives and friends, everyone celebrating without any apparent awareness of or concern about my absence. I felt the weight of that exclusion physically, a tightness in my chest and heaviness in my limbs that transcended simple emotional hurt and manifested as actual bodily sensation. The wedding represented not just a single excluded event, but the culmination of years of accumulated evidence that I was valued by my family only instrumentally, for what I could provide rather than for who I was. Every financial contribution I had made, every time I had prioritized their needs over my own, every hour I had invested in maintaining relationships that were not reciprocated, all of it had been building toward this moment when I was deemed insufficiently impressive to include in family celebrations despite my years of making those celebrations possible through my support. My phone remained silent throughout the day, no messages from family members acknowledging the wedding or my absence from it, no photographs shared that might have included conciliatory gestures toward recognizing that my exclusion was regrettable, even if they maintained it was necessary. The silence communicated that my presence was not missed, that the wedding was proceeding perfectly well without me, and that my family felt no need to acknowledge the pain of my exclusion or to make any gesture toward repair of our damaged relationships. Late that evening, after my shift had ended and I had returned to my apartment, I finally saw the first photographs from the wedding appearing on Rachel's social media accounts. The images showed exactly what I had imagined: elegant decorations and beautiful venue and guests dressed in sophisticated formal wear. Rachel looked radiant in her dress, my parents looked proud standing beside the newlyweds, and everyone appeared to be having a wonderful time at the celebration that my $4,000 had helped make possible but which I had been excluded from attending. I studied the photographs with the clinical detachment I had learned to apply to painful situations through my nursing training, observing details without allowing myself to be overwhelmed by the emotional impact. The wedding was indeed beautiful and impressive, exactly the kind of elegant affair that Rachel had envisioned. My absence had not diminished the celebration in any visible way. The event had succeeded in projecting the image of success and social status that had been prioritized over my inclusion. Whatever concerns my family had expressed about my presence creating awkwardness appeared to have been resolved quite simply through the expedient of not inviting me. The experience of viewing those photographs while sitting alone in my apartment on a Saturday night crystallized something important about my family relationships and about the choices I needed to make going forward. I had spent years hoping that my continued support and generosity would eventually result in the kind of genuine belonging and reciprocal care that I witnessed other people receiving from their families. I had believed that if I just proved myself valuable enough, if I just demonstrated sufficient commitment and willingness to sacrifice for family well-being, I would eventually be rewarded with the acceptance and appreciation that I had been working toward. The wedding exclusion had finally made explicit what had been implicit throughout those years of one-sided support. My family did not value me for who I was. They valued me for what I could provide. When my presence served their interests, through financial contributions or practical assistance, I was included and my support was accepted with minimal acknowledgement or gratitude. When my presence conflicted with their interests, through potentially creating awkward social dynamics or failing to reflect the image they wanted to project, I was excluded without apparent concern for how that exclusion would affect me or what it communicated about their actual regard for our relationships. I could not change my family's values or priorities. I could not force them to recognize my worth beyond my instrumental utility. I could not make them into people who prioritized relationships over image or who treated family members with the kind of unconditional positive regard that I had assumed was foundational to how families operated. The only thing I could change was my own choices about how much of my resources, time, and emotional energy I continued investing in relationships that were not providing reciprocal care, and that were unlikely ever to do so regardless of how much additional sacrifice I made. That night, I opened my laptop and began drafting a message that would establish clear boundaries about my future involvement with my family. The time for hoping that things would change through continued patience and understanding had passed. The time for clear communication about what I would and would not accept had arrived. The message I drafted that night went through 17 revisions before I achieved the clarity and tone I was seeking. Each version represented a slightly different balance between expressing the hurt I felt and maintaining the dignity that my family had attempted to strip from me through their treatment. I needed language that was firm without being hostile, clear about boundaries without engaging in detailed recrimination, and definitive enough that there could be no misunderstanding about what had changed and how I would relate to my family going forward. The final version began with a straightforward acknowledgement of recent events. I noted that I had been excluded from Rachel's wedding due to concerns that my presence would not align with the image she wished to project, and that my request for return of my financial contribution had been characterized as selfish and vindictive rather than as a reasonable expectation of fair treatment. I stated that these interactions had prompted me to reflect carefully on the patterns that had characterized our family relationships over many years, and that this reflection had led me to some important conclusions about boundaries I needed to establish going forward. I explained that I would no longer be available as a source of financial support for family members. The years of loans that had transformed into gifts, the contributions to various expenses and celebrations, the pattern of providing resources whenever requested without receiving reciprocal support during my own times of need, all of this would cease immediately. I was not making this decision out of anger or desire to punish anyone, but rather out of recognition that the financial dynamics in our family had become fundamentally unhealthy, and that continuing to participate in those dynamics was not sustainable for my own well-being. I continued by noting that I would also be establishing clearer boundaries around my time and availability. I would no longer be the default family member called upon for various forms of practical assistance, transportation, problem-solving, or other support that had consumed significant portions of my limited personal time without reciprocation. I needed to prioritize my own rest and recovery given the demanding nature of my work, and I needed to invest my personal time in relationships that provided mutual care, rather than one-directional service. The message concluded by expressing hope that we could eventually develop healthier family relationships built on genuine mutual respect, rather than on patterns where I provided resources and support, while receiving conditional acceptance, based on whether my life circumstances reflected positively on the family's image. I noted that I remained open to connection with family members who were willing to engage in reciprocal relationships, but that I would not continue investing in dynamics that had proven to be exploitative regardless of how much patience and understanding I demonstrated. I sent the message on Sunday evening, addressing it to my parents and Rachel with the same distribution list I had used for my previous communication about the wedding contribution. The act of pressing send felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, a definitive step toward protecting myself that also represented potential permanent damage to family relationships that, despite their dysfunction, had been central to my identity and sense of belonging for my entire life. The responses began arriving within hours, and they followed precisely the escalation pattern that Dr. Chan had predicted. My mother called repeatedly, leaving increasingly distressed voicemails about how hurt and shocked she was by my message, characterizing my boundary setting as a cruel rejection of the family that had always loved and supported me. She reminded me of various times during my childhood and adolescence when my parents had provided for me, framing those historical instances of normal parental responsibility as though they created unlimited future obligation for me to provide financial support without expectation of fair treatment in return. Rachel sent a lengthy text message that veered between anger and manipulation, first accusing me of being bitter and jealous about her marriage and success, then suggesting that perhaps I was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis that was causing me to behave so irrationally. She noted that she had always looked up to me as her older sister, and that she was devastated to see me transforming into someone so cold and calculating about family relationships. The message concluded with a statement that she hoped I would get whatever help I needed to work through my obvious issues, and that when I was ready to apologize and return to being the sister she used to know, she would be willing to consider forgiving me. My father's response came via email and carried the tone of someone delivering a final ultimatum. He wrote that I had made my position clear, and that the family would respect my wishes by no longer contacting me for any form of support or assistance. However, he continued, I should understand that this decision would have consequences for our relationships. If I was choosing to prioritize money and petty grievances over family bonds, then I should not expect to be included in future family gatherings or celebrations. He noted that family was supposed to be about unconditional love and support, and that my apparent inability to provide that support without keeping score suggested that perhaps I had never really understood what family meant. The irony of my father lecturing me about unconditional love and support while simultaneously threatening to exclude me from family gatherings if I did not continue providing financial resources was almost amusing in its complete lack of self-awareness. The message revealed with perfect clarity the transactional nature of how my family understood our relationships, even as they claimed to be advocating for unconditional bonds. I was expected to provide unconditional support regardless of how I was treated, while their acceptance of me was explicitly conditional on my continued willingness to serve as a financial resource and to accept whatever treatment they decided was appropriate. I did not respond to any of these messages, maintaining the boundary of silence that communicated my position was not subject to negotiation or debate. Each message I received only reinforced my conviction that establishing these boundaries was necessary and overdue. My family's response to my boundary setting revealed that they had no interest in examining their own behavior, or in considering whether their treatment of me had been fair or appropriate. Instead, they were focused entirely on how my boundaries inconvenienced them, and on what tactics might succeed in pressuring me back into compliance with their expectations. Over the following weeks, I experienced a complex mixture of emotions as I adjusted to my new relationship with my family. There was relief in no longer carrying the constant low-level anxiety about when the next request for financial help would arrive, or how I would manage to provide it, while maintaining my own financial stability. There was satisfaction in having finally articulated boundaries that protected my resources and well-being after years of prioritizing others' needs over my own. There was also grief about the loss of family relationships that, despite their dysfunction, had represented my primary source of belonging and connection throughout my life. The grief was particularly acute during moments when I would have traditionally engaged with family members. The holidays that year passed without the usual gatherings and celebrations, as my father's threat to exclude me from family events materialized into actual absence of invitations or communication. I worked through Christmas at the hospital, volunteering to take the holiday shift so that colleagues with young children could spend the day with their families. The work provided helpful distraction and purposeful activity, but it could not completely eliminate the sadness of spending a major holiday alone, while knowing that my family was gathered together without me. My colleagues at the hospital became increasingly important sources of social connection and support during this period. Jennifer remained my closest confidant, providing both practical advice and emotional support as I navigated the aftermath of establishing boundaries with my family. She invited me to join her family for Thanksgiving, an offer I initially declined out of reluctance to impose on her family's celebration, but eventually accepted when she insisted that having me there would be a contribution rather than an imposition. The experience of being welcomed into her family's gathering with genuine warmth and inclusion, without any assessment of whether my presence enhanced or diminished the image they wanted to project, provided powerful contrast to my own family's conditional acceptance. Other colleagues who learned about my situation through casual conversation offered similar gestures of inclusion and support. I was invited to various social gatherings and celebrations during the holiday season, opportunities to connect with people outside of work contexts, and to begin building a social network that was not dependent on family relationships. These invitations came from people who valued me for who I was rather than for what I could provide, who enjoyed my company without requiring that I demonstrate sufficient success or status to justify their association with me. The financial impact of ceasing to provide support to my family was immediately visible in my bank account balances. Without the regular outflow of money toward various family needs and requests, I was able to increase my student loan payments substantially, make progress toward building emergency savings beyond the minimal level I had maintained for years, and begin considering possibilities like contributing to retirement accounts or saving for future goals that had seemed perpetually out of reach when my income was being redirected toward family support. I calculated that over the 8 years during which I had been providing financial assistance to family members, I had transferred approximately $37,000 through a combination of direct loans, contributions to specific expenses, and accumulated smaller payments for meals, gifts, and miscellaneous costs. That amount represented more than half of my annual salary, an enormous sum that had been extracted from my resources gradually enough that I had never fully confronted the total magnitude of what I was providing. Had I retained and invested that money instead of transferring it to family members who did not reciprocate, I could have paid off my student loans entirely and established substantial savings that would have provided both financial security and flexibility to pursue opportunities or weather unexpected expenses. The realization of how much I had sacrificed financially to support family members who ultimately excluded me from celebrations because they found my life circumstances embarrassing created complicated emotional responses. There was anger about the years of exploitation, and about how much my own financial stability and future opportunities had been compromised to enable my family to maintain lifestyles they could not afford through their own resources. There was also a strange sense of freedom in recognizing that I no longer needed to organize my financial life around their unpredictable requests for support, that I could make decisions about spending and saving based solely on my own needs and goals, rather than on the requirement to maintain capacity to help family members whenever they experience financial difficulties. My work at the hospital took on increased significance during this period, providing not only income and professional identity, but also a sense of purpose and value that had been undermined by my family's dismissal of nursing as an insufficiently impressive career. The patients I cared for and their families regularly expressed profound gratitude for the skill and compassion I brought to their care during moments of crisis and vulnerability. These expressions of appreciation provided important counterweight to my family's characterization of my work as unremarkable or as evidence of limited ambition and achievement. I began to recognize patterns in my nursing practice that paralleled the dynamics I had experienced in my family relationships. As a nurse, particularly in intensive care settings, the role required tremendous skill, knowledge, and dedication. Yet the work was often invisible or undervalued by people who did not understand the complexity and importance of what nurses actually did. Patients might remember and express gratitude toward their physicians, who made dramatic interventions during brief visits, while not fully recognizing that their survival and recovery depended heavily on the continuous skilled monitoring and care provided by nurses who were present for the entire duration of their hospital stay. This parallel between the undervaluing of nursing work and the undervaluing of my role in my family helped me understand that the problem was not actually about my choices or achievements being inadequate. The problem was about how certain types of essential labor and care become invisible precisely because they are performed reliably and competently, creating the illusion that the work is simple or unimportant rather than recognizing that apparent seamlessness actually reflects high skill level and sustained effort. My parents had been able to maintain their lifestyle partially through my financial support, but that support had been provided so consistently and with so little acknowledgement required that it had become invisible to them, simply part of the background conditions that enabled their comfort rather than recognized as ongoing sacrifice on my part. Rachel had been able to have the expensive wedding she envisioned partially through my contribution, but because I had not made a dramatic scene about providing the money or demanded recognition for my generosity, the contribution had been absorbed into the general wedding budget without particular awareness of its significance. The invisibility of my contributions had made them easy to dismiss when my family decided that my presence at the wedding would be problematic. If they had been more conscious of how much I had actually provided over the years, both financially and through various forms of practical support, they might have experienced greater conflict about excluding me or might have recognized that fair treatment required either including me in celebrations or returning my financial contributions. But because my support had been so consistent and had required so little visible effort on my part to provide, it had not registered as significant enough to create obligation or to complicate their decisions about how to treat me. 3 months after I had sent the message establishing boundaries, I received an unexpected phone call from my mother. I almost did not answer, having grown accustomed to allowing family calls to go to voicemail, so that I could determine whether they warranted response, or whether engaging would simply provide opportunity for additional manipulation and pressure. However, something about the timing of this particular call, arriving on a Tuesday evening when there was no obvious trigger or family event that might have prompted it, created curiosity that overcame my reluctance to engage. "Victoria, I wanted to talk with you about something that's come up," my mother began, her tone notably different from the emotional distress that had characterized her previous messages. She sounded calm and measured, almost businesslike, in a way that immediately created wariness about what was coming next. "What is it, Mom?" There was a brief pause before she continued, as though she was carefully considering how to phrase whatever she needed to communicate. "Your father lost his job 3 weeks ago. The manufacturing company has been struggling financially, and they've been doing rounds of layoffs. He's been looking for new positions, but the job market is difficult for someone his age, and we're starting to face some serious financial problems. We've been managing on my income and his unemployment benefits, but those benefits are going to run out in a few months, and we have expenses that we can't cover on just what I'm making." I listened to this information with the detachment of someone who was no longer emotionally invested in solving my family's problems, hearing the words but not feeling the automatic impulse to offer help that would have characterized my response just months earlier. I waited for her to continue rather than immediately offering solutions or expressing concern, maintaining silence that communicated I was listening but not assuming responsibility for addressing whatever difficulties she was describing. "We're going to need to ask if you could help us with the mortgage payments for a few months while your father finds new work," she said finally, delivering the actual purpose of the call. "We don't want to lose the house, and we've always been able to count on you during difficult times. I know things have been strained between us recently, but this is a genuine emergency, and we're hoping you can put aside our disagreements long enough to help us get through this crisis." The request was framed in language designed to make refusal seem cruel and petty, positioning the mortgage assistance as a temporary emergency measure, rather than as continuation of the long-term pattern, where I provided financial support without reciprocation. The reference to putting aside our disagreements suggested that my boundary setting was comparable in importance to their financial crisis, rather than recognizing that my boundaries existed precisely because of years of exploitation that this request would perpetuate. "Mom, I'm sorry that Dad lost his job and that you're facing financial difficulties. However, I meant what I said in my message 3 months ago about no longer being available to provide financial support to the family. I need to prioritize my own financial stability, and I can't continue subsidizing your expenses while you exclude me from family relationships except when you need money." My mother's response revealed that the calm businesslike tone had been a strategic choice, rather than a reflection of actual emotional state. Her voice shifted immediately into hurt and anger that suggested she had expected my boundaries to dissolve when confronted with genuine need. "I cannot believe you would refuse to help your own parents keep their home. After everything we did for you, raising you and supporting you through your education, you're going to abandon us during the hardest time of our lives because you're still upset about not being invited to Rachel's wedding? That is incredibly selfish, Victoria, and it shows a side of you that I honestly never thought existed. We're talking about us losing our house, and you care more about your hurt feelings than about your parents' actual survival." The characterization of my boundary as abandonment and the suggestion that refusing to pay their mortgage represented prioritizing hurt feelings over their survival exemplified exactly the manipulative framing that had made it difficult for me to establish boundaries in the first place. My parents were not facing homelessness or genuine survival crisis. They were facing the need to adjust their lifestyle to match their reduced income, potentially downsizing to a smaller home, or making other changes that would bring their expenses in line with what they could afford through my mother's income and my father's unemployment benefits while he searched for new employment. "Mom, I'm not responsible for paying your mortgage. You're both adults who need to manage your own finances. If the house is no longer affordable on your current income, then you need to make whatever adjustments are necessary, whether that's downsizing, refinancing, or finding other solutions. I can't continue providing financial support that prevents you from making realistic decisions about what lifestyle you can actually afford." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with my mother cycling through various emotional appeals and accusations designed to make me feel guilty enough to reverse my boundary. She reminded me of specific instances during my childhood when my parents had provided for me, as though normal parental responsibility created unlimited obligation for adult children to subsidize their parents' lifestyle choices. She suggested that my refusal to help indicated that I had been damaged by my divorce, or by the stress of my nursing career, implying that my boundaries reflected psychological problems, rather than healthy self-protection. She warned that my father would be devastated when she told him I had refused to help, and that this might cause permanent damage to our relationship that I would regret for the rest of my life. Each manipulation attempt was designed to trigger the guilt and sense of obligation that had previously ensured my compliance. However, the months since establishing boundaries had given me practice in recognizing these tactics and maintaining my position despite emotional pressure. I repeated several times that I was not going to provide mortgage payments, and that they needed to develop solutions that did not depend on my financial support. Eventually, my mother ended the call abruptly, her final words conveying that she was shocked and disappointed by who I had become, and that she needed time to process the fact that she could no longer count on her daughter during times of genuine need. After the call ended, I sat in my apartment experiencing the complicated emotions that accompanied maintaining boundaries in the face of family crisis. There was satisfaction in having held my position despite intense emotional manipulation. There was also some guilt about refusing to help parents who had indeed provided for me during my childhood, and who were genuinely facing financial stress. However, I recognized that the guilt was based on the beliefs I was working to unlearn, beliefs that my value was connected to my usefulness to others, and that establishing boundaries represented selfishness rather than necessary self-protection. I called Dr. Chun the following day to process the interaction, and to reinforce my understanding of why maintaining boundaries was important, even when family members characterized those boundaries as cruel abandonment. She validated my response and helped me see that my parents' financial difficulties, while genuinely stressful for them, were not actually my responsibility to solve. They had made various financial decisions over the years, including using their resources to provide more comprehensive support for Rachel's education than they had provided for mine, and including maintaining a lifestyle that required my subsidies to sustain. The natural consequence of those decisions was that they now needed to adjust their circumstances to match their actual income, rather than continuing to depend on my financial support to maintain a lifestyle they could not otherwise afford. The months that followed brought additional requests and pressure, as my family attempted various approaches to breaking down my boundaries and restoring the previous dynamic where I provided support without reciprocation. Each attempt followed similar patterns of emotional manipulation combined with characterizations of my boundaries as evidence of selfishness or psychological problems. Each time, I maintained my position with increasing confidence and decreasing emotional turmoil, recognizing that their resistance to my boundaries confirmed that those boundaries were necessary, and that my previous pattern of compliance had indeed been exploitative rather than representing normal family reciprocity. The spring following my establishment of boundaries brought unexpected developments that illuminated the deeper patterns underlying my family's treatment of me. I had settled into a new equilibrium characterized by absence of contact with my parents and Rachel, increased financial stability as I retained income that had previously been redirected toward family support, and growing investment in friendships and professional relationships that provided genuine reciprocity rather than one-directional obligation. The grief about damaged family relationships had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed from acute pain into something more like persistent background awareness of loss that no longer dominated my emotional landscape. In April, I received a message from my cousin Diana, my mother's niece who lived in Seattle, and with whom I had maintained cordial, but not particularly close relationship over the years. Diana was several years younger than me, and had always seemed to occupy a peripheral position in family dynamics, present at major gatherings but not deeply integrated into the core family unit consisting of my parents, Rachel, and myself. Her message arrived via social media rather than through phone or text, suggesting some hesitation about making direct contact. The message began with general pleasantries and inquiries about how I was doing, then transitioned into the actual purpose of her communication. Diana explained that she had been spending more time with my parents recently, having moved back to Portland 6 months earlier after completing graduate school and accepting a position with a technology company. She had been joining them for regular dinners and had been helping them with various projects around their house, enjoying the opportunity to connect with extended family now that she was living in the same city again. However, Diana continued, she had begun noticing some concerning patterns in how my parents discussed me during these interactions. They frequently made references to my instability and poor judgment, characterizing my decision to establish boundaries as evidence of psychological problems that had been developing for some time. They portrayed themselves as worried parents dealing with a daughter who had become increasingly difficult and unreasonable, someone who had rejected family connections because of mental health issues that she refused to acknowledge or address. The narrative they had constructed positioned me as the family member with problems rather than as someone who had responded appropriately to years of exploitation and conditional acceptance. Diana wrote that she had initially accepted these characterizations without questioning them, assuming that my parents would not misrepresent the situation, and that there must be some validity to their concerns. However, she had recently encountered Rachel at a family event and had asked casually about me, expressing sympathy about the difficulties my parents had described. Rachel's response had been notably different from the worried concern that my parents displayed. Instead, Rachel had laughed and made a dismissive comment about me being bitter, because I was not successful enough to be included in her wedding, revealing that the exclusion had been based on status assessment rather than on genuine concerns about my well-being or behavior. This contradiction between my parents' narrative of worried concern and Rachel's casual revelation about the actual basis for my exclusion had prompted Diana to question what was really happening. She had begun paying closer attention during subsequent interactions with my parents, and had noticed that their expressions of concern about my mental health seemed to serve primarily as explanation for why I was no longer providing financial support or participating in family activities. The worried parent narrative allowed them to maintain their self-image as loving family members while avoiding any examination of whether their own treatment of me might have been problematic. Diana's message concluded by expressing that she wanted me to know what was being said about me within the family, both because she thought I deserved to understand how I was being characterized, and because she was increasingly uncomfortable being positioned as my replacement in family dynamics. She noted that my parents had been treating her with notable generosity and attention since she had moved back to Portland, inviting her to frequent meals, expressing interest in her career, and generally providing the kind of engaged family connection that she had not previously experienced from them. While she appreciated the attention, she was beginning to recognize that her role in the family system might be filling the vacancy I had left when I established boundaries, and that her value to them might be similarly contingent on her continued availability to meet their needs. I read Diana's message multiple times, processing the information about how my family was characterizing me, and considering the implications of their construction of a narrative that positioned me as mentally unstable, rather than as someone who had established appropriate boundaries in response to exploitation. The strategy was sophisticated in its way, allowing my family to maintain their self-perception as reasonable people who had done nothing wrong while explaining my absence and boundary setting as symptoms of my psychological problems rather than as legitimate responses to genuine mistreatment. I responded to Diana's message with appreciation for her willingness to share this information and to question the narrative she was being presented. I provided a straightforward summary of what had actually occurred, including the wedding exclusion, the years of financial support that had not been reciprocated, and my decision to establish boundaries after recognizing that the family dynamics were fundamentally exploitative rather than mutually supportive. I explained that I had not been discussing these matters with extended family, because I had no interest in creating broader family conflict, or in recruiting people to take sides in what I viewed as primarily an issue between my immediate family and myself. However, I continued, I thought Diana should know that my parents had a pattern of seeking out family members who could fill particular roles in their lives, providing attention and apparent care as long as those family members served useful functions, then withdrawing that investment when the family members were no longer useful or began establishing boundaries that limited their availability. I suggested that she pay attention to whether my parents' interest in her was contingent on her continued availability to help with various needs, and whether the warmth of their attention might shift if she ever needed to prioritize her own needs over their expectations. Diana responded within a few hours, thanking me for the context and noting that my explanation aligned with patterns she had already been noticing in her interactions with my parents. She shared that they had recently asked her for help with a substantial home repair project, framing it as an opportunity for her to spend time with family, while also saving them the cost of hiring professionals. She had agreed because she enjoyed home improvement projects, and because she valued developing closer relationships with extended family. However, the project had expanded significantly beyond the original scope, consuming multiple weekends and requiring her to purchase various tools and materials that my parents had promised to reimburse, but had not yet paid for despite the project being completed weeks earlier. Additionally, Diana mentioned that my parents had begun making occasional comments about financial stress and about various expenses they were struggling to cover, remarks that seemed designed to prompt offers of assistance even though they had not yet made direct requests for money. She recognized these as potentially the early stages of the same pattern of financial exploitation that I had experienced, groundwork being laid for future requests that would be framed as temporary emergency assistance, but that would likely transform into ongoing subsidies if she allowed the pattern to develop. The conversation with Diana prompted me to reflect on how my family's response to my boundaries had evolved beyond simply attempting to pressure me back into compliance. They had not accepted my establishment of boundaries as legitimate or as prompting any self-examination about whether their treatment of me had been appropriate. Instead, they had constructed an alternative narrative that preserved their self-image while explaining away my absence, and they had begun cultivating a replacement relationship with another family member who could potentially serve some of the functions I had previously filled. This pattern of replacement rather than reflection was particularly revealing about the fundamental nature of how my family understood relationships. If they had genuinely valued me as an individual rather than as someone who filled useful roles in their lives, my absence would have prompted grief and attempts at genuine reconciliation that involved acknowledging their problematic behavior and making meaningful changes. Instead, my absence had prompted them to find someone else who could provide similar utility, suggesting that what they valued was not actually relationship with me specifically, but rather access to someone who would provide support and assistance without requiring reciprocity. I shared this realization during my next therapy session with Dr. Chun, who validated my interpretation and helped me understand how this pattern reflected broader dynamics common in families organized around exploitation of certain members. In these systems, the exploited individuals are valued instrumentally rather than intrinsically, and their departure from the system prompts not reflection or change, but rather recruitment of new members who can fill similar functional roles. The family structure remains fundamentally unchanged because the problem is not recognized as stemming from the family's expectations or behavior, but rather as resulting from the exploited individual's decision to stop accepting their assigned role. Dr. Chun noted that the construction of a narrative characterizing me as mentally unstable represented a particularly insidious form of manipulation because it served multiple functions simultaneously. It explained my absence and boundary setting in ways that did not require my family to examine their own behavior. It potentially damaged my reputation with extended family members who might otherwise question why I had distanced myself from my parents and Rachel. It created justification for excluding me from future family events and relationships by suggesting that I was not psychologically stable enough to be trusted with normal family interactions. And it positioned any attempts I might make to correct the false narrative as potentially confirming the narrative itself, since defending myself against accusations of instability could be interpreted as evidence of the defensive behavior that unstable people exhibit. However, Dr. Chun continued, the most important consideration was not how to counter my family's false narrative, but rather how to continue building a life that reflected my actual values and priorities independent of their characterizations. People who knew me through direct interaction would form their own assessments based on how I actually behaved rather than on secondhand narratives from my family. Extended family members who chose to accept my parents' characterization without seeking my perspective were revealing their own unwillingness to question authority figures or to investigate situations that were presented to them in simplified terms. My energy was better invested in developing genuine relationships with people who valued me appropriately rather than in attempting to manage my reputation among people who were content to accept misleading narratives without verification. This perspective helped me understand that Diana's willingness to question the narrative she was being presented and to reach out to me directly represented exactly the kind of discernment and integrity that characterized people worth investing in relationship with. She had noticed contradictions in what she was being told, had sought additional information rather than simply accepting the dominant narrative, and had made her own assessment about whether my family's characterization seemed consistent with other evidence she was observing. Her approach demonstrated the intellectual honesty and relational courage that were prerequisites for genuine connection, rather than superficial family obligation. Over the following weeks, Diana and I developed a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared recognition of family dynamics that had previously been invisible to both of us. She continued spending time with my parents but maintained clearer boundaries about what she was willing to provide, politely declining requests that would have required significant financial investment or that would have established expectations for ongoing support. She reported that my parents' warmth toward her had cooled noticeably once she began setting these boundaries, confirming the conditional nature of their interest in relationship with her. The experience of watching my family attempt to replace me with another family member who could serve similar functions created interesting emotional responses. There was validation in seeing the pattern confirmed so clearly, in recognizing that my interpretation of family dynamics had been accurate rather than distorted by hurt feelings or excessive sensitivity. There was also a strange sense of grief about being so easily replaced, about discovering that my specific individual presence had mattered less than I had hoped, and that someone else could apparently fill my role in the family system without anyone experiencing significant loss from my absence. However, underneath these responses was a growing sense of liberation from the need to prove my worth, or to earn belonging through continued sacrifice and service. My family's behavior had demonstrated conclusively that no amount of financial support or self-sacrifice would ever be sufficient to secure the kind of unconditional acceptance and genuine care that healthy families provide. The problem had never been that I was not giving enough or sacrificing sufficiently. The problem was that my family operated according to a transactional model, where relationships were valued based on utility, rather than on intrinsic worth, and where conditional acceptance would always remain conditional regardless of how many conditions were satisfied. In May, approximately 7 months after establishing boundaries with my family, I received notification that I had been selected to participate in a professional development program for experienced ICU nurses who demonstrated leadership potential. The program was competitive and highly regarded within the nursing community, providing advanced training in clinical leadership, quality improvement, and healthcare systems management. Selection for the program was based on a combination of clinical performance evaluations, recommendations from supervisors and colleagues, and demonstrated commitment to advancing nursing practice through innovation and excellence in patient care. I had applied to the program several months earlier without significant expectation of being selected, viewing the application primarily as a useful exercise in articulating my professional goals and accomplishments rather than as likely path to actual participation. The notification of my selection arrived via email during a rare evening when I was home early from work, and I read it multiple times before fully processing that I had been chosen from what I knew was a substantial pool of qualified applicants from hospitals throughout the region. The program would begin in August and would run for 6 months, requiring attendance at monthly intensive weekend sessions and completion of a capstone project that applied the leadership concepts to practical improvements in my hospital's ICU operations. Successful completion would result in an advanced certification in clinical nursing leadership, and would position me for potential advancement into formal leadership roles such as charge nurse, clinical educator, or nursing supervisor. The program also included substantial networking opportunities with nursing leaders from other institutions, and with healthcare administrators who regularly recruited program graduates for positions that combined clinical expertise with operational responsibility. I felt a surge of pride and excitement that was immediately followed by the reflexive impulse to share this news with my family, to call my parents and Rachel, and tell them about this recognition of my professional capabilities and potential. The impulse was so automatic that I had actually picked up my phone and begun scrolling to my mother's contact before I consciously recognized what I was doing and stopped myself. The desire to share good news with family, and to receive their celebration and pride in my accomplishments was so deeply ingrained that it persisted despite months of no contact, and despite clear evidence that my family did not actually value my professional achievements. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.